Okay, we're back for another Ask the Expert, this time on polling. We have with us today Dr. Natalie Jackson. Dr. Jackson is the Director of Research at the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to conducting independent research at the intersection of religion, culture, and public policy. Welcome, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we're going to jump right in. So I think a great question to ask someone who has your expertise is we think about lots of people say, oh, I don't believe the polls. I don't know anyone who's ever called. So thinking about that, can you tell us how you can talk to just, a little over 1,000 people and learn something about what people are thinking in the United States?
Sure. So the fundamental basis of any poll is that it's a sample of Americans in this case. It's a sample of whatever population you want to represent. And if you think about it, your options for gathering the opinions of a large group of people are to talk to a few and try to generalize those out, or to try to talk to everyone. If you've been tracking the census discussions this year at all, you know that the census is attempting to count every American in everyone in the country and try to really genuinely talk to everyone. That costs billions of dollars.
Right.
We can't, every time we want to know people's opinions on something, we can't go out and conduct a census. So what we have to do is take a sample. But we need that sample to be representative. You can't just go down to 7-Eleven and talk to a few people and say, oh, I know what people think. Well, no, you know what those few people at 7-Eleven think. What you need to do a good survey is get a representative sample. That's harder than it sounds. So what you need to be able to do that is a list of everyone in the country, if the country is your sample. If OU students are who you want to survey, you need a list of all OU students. That's actually a much easier thing to get than a list of all US residents.
Right.
That list doesn't exist. So we have to figure out ways to get some approximation of everyone in the country. There are various ways that pollsters try to do this. The one that worked really well for a while back in the 1980s and 1990s was to do random digit dialing. And what that means is by telephone, you would randomly generate a whole bunch of telephone numbers. This worked because most Americans had a household telephone. They don't anymore, but at that point they did. And so by generating a completely random set of telephone numbers throughout the US, we could get a truly random sample of US residents. And that randomness is what assures us representation. It's randomness combined with the ability for everyone to be sampled. And since most people had a home telephone, it checked that box too. Now we have a more complicated situation because if you think about it, how many of you actually have landline telephones?
Not me.
I don't. I haven't had one for 15 years probably.
Same.
So, maybe you have one in a dorm room or in an apartment that just happened to be there, but chances are you don't ever use it. So now we have to try to find people on their cell phones. That's a lot harder. How often do you answer your cell phone to an unknown number? I do this work for a living and I don't answer my cell phone to unknown numbers. So it's become quite difficult to get a truly random sample of Americans by telephone. This is why you've seen innovation in the direction of using the internet. At the same time, though, the problem there is we don't have a national registry of everyone in the US who's on the internet. We would need their email addresses. That doesn't exist. So how can we randomly sample people off the internet when we don't have the information to do that? Well, we can't. So the way pollsters try to get a representative sample from the internet is they try to get as many people as possible to sign up to take surveys, to say, okay, take this survey and we'll give you points, or we'll give you a gift card, or we'll give you some small amount of money. And then they select really carefully. They recruit the widest possible range of Americans, all categories, all nationalities, all ages, everything you could think of. They're trying to get as representative as possible. And then they select who is asked to take each survey in order to get a representative sample. So there's a lot that goes into it. Mm-hmm. That means that, to come back to the original question, taking a long walk around here, if you have never been called or never been contacted to take a survey, that's actually perfectly reasonable. If you think about the fact that there are around 230 million American adults, and we usually are referring to adults when we talk about political polls, every 1,000 of those represents a very small proportion. However, the fact that we've designed these samples to be representative of everyone means that those 1,000 people are standing in for the 230 million. That also means that your odds of getting contacted are very low, especially if you haven't signed up to take any web surveys. So it's, to kind of bring it all together, it's really not surprising that you or no one you know has been contacted for a survey. Someone like you somewhere has been contacted to take that survey, and their opinion, while it might be different from yours at the individual level, is aggregated up. And so through the power of representative sampling and aggregation, we're able to make statements about what people in the United States generally think.
So when we report polls or see polls, usually it's reported with a margin of error, right? And that's because you have a sample, there's a margin of error. So if you explain what it means, we say, Vice President Biden is ahead of Trump by 5 points, plus or minus 4. So what does that mean?
So the margin of error accounts for the fact that we have only sampled 1,000 people out of those 230 million. The law of large numbers in statistics means that we actually don't only need about 1,000 people out of 230 million to get reasonably close. But of course, there is some error. So the margin of error represents the amount of theoretical difference. It's theoretical because we don't know. We don't have the full 230 million. The amount of theoretical difference between the estimate that we get from our poll and where reality might be. So we expect that about 95% of the time, samples of 1,000 Americans will be within about 3 percentage points of where reality is if you talk to everyone, all the 230 million. So if you have an estimate that says 45% of people prefer Joe Biden, what that plus or minus 3 means is that in reality, that could be as high as 48% or as low as 42%. 45% is where we think it is. But if we took a different sample of 1,000, we might get somewhere between 42 and 48 instead of 45. If we took 100 different samples of 1,000, 95 of them would give us an estimate between 42 and 48. Some would be right on 45.
So go ahead.
That extra 5, those could be anywhere. And that's a risk that occurs in surveys. You could get a sample that is out in left field, but 95% of the time, the answer will be somewhere in that range of the margin of error.
Thanks. So that makes sense. And then sometimes we see these polls like, wow, that number is really off. It could be that 5% of polls that are just off. Yeah. So one more sort of technical question, I think, about polling. Sometimes we hear the term weighting. What does that mean when polls are weighted?
So the base answer to that is every single poll that you see should be weighted. What weighting means, so we went through all of this process trying to get a good representative sample. So we called a bunch of people that would have been representative. We sent emails out to people that would be representative of the population. Not everyone is going to answer. Even if it's an email where you've signed up for something, maybe you don't have time today, so you just delete the email and you don't answer. So what weighting does is weighting is designed to account for the distance between what we know our survey population should look like, what our sample should be, versus what we got due to a variety of issues, mostly, people not responding to the email or the phone call. So for example, young Americans are notoriously difficult to get to answer polls. The people in the 18 to 29 age range are just, it's a hard to reach group. You're busy, you're doing things, you don't answer your phone when unknown numbers call, all that sort of thing. So if, let's say, 18 to 29-year-olds should be 25% of the population. I don't know that off the top of my head, so that might be slightly off. But for the example right now, let's say they're 25% of the population in the census. But in our survey, they're only 18% of the respondents. What we do is we apply a mathematical factor to make those 18% in our 1,000 people actually come up to 25% that they should be, so that our survey is representative of the 25% of 18 to 29-year-olds that should exist in the population, rather than letting those go underrepresented.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's obviously it's hard to get a perfectly representative sample. So you can sometimes tweak a little bit on the back end, make some answers count more, some people count more respondents, and some people count a little less. It's a very vague way of putting that. I should say, if you want to learn how to run polls like Dr. Jackson does, it's a lot of statistical courses. A lot of courses just in polling and then experience. So you don't sort of just decide, I'm going to do this. There is a lot of training, and Dr. Jackson has it from OU, right?
Yes.
Yep, got to plug our OU program. Okay, so let's move a little bit. So we talked about sort of the math and statistics behind this. But so there's also the questions you ask can be important too, just as important as the technique of sort of how you add up the numbers. So could you maybe briefly talk a little bit about what makes a good question and what makes a bad question? And then what are the consequences of bad questions?
I think the first thing that it's really important to keep top of mind is that every word you put into a survey question matters. Every word choice that you make could skew someone's opinion. There's a large difference between asking, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Donald Trump is doing in office, versus, do you think Donald Trump is doing an okay job in office? The choice between saying approve or disapprove, or okay, or some other set of potential answers, is one that is very consequential. Pollsters typically adopt the approve disapprove language because it's balanced. You're providing both a positive and a negative option. Usually that is actually more than just two options. Usually it's strongly approve, approve, disapprove, or strongly disapprove, to add some nuance to it. So that's one element of a good question, is it's balanced. It offers both sides, or all possible sides. In this case, there are only two, but it offers all possible answers to the question in a reasonable way. It gets very sticky when you start talking about policy issues, because as you're probably learning, most policy issues are very nuanced. My organization does a lot of surveying about abortion issues and LGBT rights issues, and it's pretty difficult to ask some of these questions. One example is that we are working on right now is a question about the idea that businesses should or should not be able to refuse service to LGBT people based on the business owner's religious views. Hot topic, lots of different opinions out there. It combines religious liberty, does the business owner have that right to their religious views impacting their business? Business freedom, can they run the business how they please? And LGBT rights. So crafting all of that into a question is just incredibly complex. And so the wording that we use is one of many possible routes. So you end up saying, okay, we think this is the best possible question. It's balanced, it offers, do you support or oppose business owners being able to refuse service to LGBT people if doing so would violate their religious beliefs? That's the basic question wording we use. So we've offered both sides. We've presented all parts of the argument. And from there, we have to hope that people understand the question and can give it a cognizant answer. In general, that breaks a couple of traditional survey best practice things that you'll hear. In general, people will say, keep your questions simple, only ask about one thing at a time. So in theory, you would say, ask about the religious liberty, then ask about the business permission, then ask about LGBT rights. In practice, all these things get tied together. And so sometimes you have to break that rule. So this is where the art of, it's often said surveying is an art and a science. Mm-hmm. The prior stuff about sampling and law of large numbers and all of that is the science of it. Question writing is really where the art comes in. But the two most important principles are keep it simple so that people can understand it, of course, with the caveat that that's not always possible. Right. And always present balanced questions. Do not try to skew opinion with your question.
Right. Yeah. So I think of an example of a bad question is, do you like Obamacare? Because that automatically loads on the political dimension. So Republicans will say, I don't like it. Democrats will say, I like it. And so you're really just asking people their partisanship. But I think if you then ask people, do you like the fact that children can stay on their parents' health insurance until they turn 26? Do you like the fact that certain things are covered, which are components of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare? They like all those. And so you're getting at the same thing, but asking the question a different way. And so that's one reason, among others, that you've talked about, that the questions are, I think, important. So let me ask another sort of political question. So the polls predicted Hillary Clinton would win in 2016, but she did not. So were the polls really wrong per se? And if so, like what mistakes did pollsters perhaps made in the run-up to that election?
There's a lot of nuance to the question. It's not a straight up and down, were the polls wrong or right. There's a distinction that we have to make between national and state level polls. Mm-hmm. That's because of the Electoral College. as I hope you know, the national popular vote is not what elects the president. It's the electoral college vote, getting the majority or the largest share of votes in enough states to add up to the 270 electoral votes. What that led to in 2016, since we had a split between the popular vote, where Hillary Clinton won, and the Electoral College, where Donald Trump won, and therefore won the presidency, it looks like polls did worse than they did at the national level. So nationally speaking, polls had Hillary Clinton on average up 3 to 5 percentage points right before the election. Her actual margin was, I believe, about 2 percentage points. So that was a very reasonable distance. Again, going back to the margin of error, remember that polls always have that error. So saying that Hillary Clinton would get 47% of the vote means that it could be anywhere from 44 to 51, for example. So the fact that she got about 48% was a good outcome for polling. At the state level, things got a little bit murkier. In general, in the polling industry, the money and the attention goes to national polling. It costs a lot of money to do a high quality poll. And so you want that rewarded with appropriate attention. By doing a state level poll, you're automatically restricting your attention level mostly to that state, unless you're, a battleground state in a presidential contest. But even then, there's not as much funding and resourcing dedicated to state level polls, even in the presidential elections. So we had fewer polls in the states, in these key states that Trump won. Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin were the biggest surprises. There just weren't that many polls, and there weren't that many high quality polls. Everything that I discussed earlier about being very careful in your sampling and in your design for how to get people to answer your poll, that can all be ignored. And you can run a poll just on the internet of, people that you can get to come to your website. So those things do exist. They're cheap, they're easy to do. And so those things do exist, and they unfortunately get coverage. And so there was a little bit of a discrepancy in the quality of the state level polling that we had. Even in the high quality state polls, though, the Trump win in those 3 key states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, was not really anticipated. And there are a couple of things at play there. One is, there could be very real movement at the last minute. In 2016, there were a lot of things happening in the last week before the election, especially there was the FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails was reopened and reclosed, just right, right in front of the election. There's no way a poll could capture that happenings within a couple of days of the election. The other thing, though, that pollsters can do something about is that at the state level, they seem to systematically underestimate the number of Americans or whatever state residents without a college degree who would vote. And I mentioned earlier that some groups are more difficult to get to answer polls than others. Lower education folks are people without college degrees who are more likely, maybe they're working shift work, maybe they're just their schedules are different, or they're just more difficult to get to answer polls than higher educated people. And that not being accounted for in people's weighting was actually an issue. So at the national level, most pollsters were weighting on education so that the education rates were appropriately represented. At the state level, that wasn't happening. So there has been a move to improve that. But the basic, the crux of the question is that national polls did quite well in 2016 and the state level polls did not. Therefore, the forecasts based on the state level polls did not predict the electoral college outcome, leading to this whole, narrative of the polls were wrong, which is partially correct, but not completely.
So we'll get to forecasting in just a second. So is it fair to say when we're waiting, especially when we're waiting on a poll that's asking about who you're going to vote for, there's a little bit of a guess for who's actually going to turn out to vote, or which groups. So if you're trying to say, well, how many people in the U.S. have a college education, we know that more or less. But saying how many people in that group will turn out to vote, we don't really know. We can guess, but it could vary from year to year. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. That's also a huge piece of it. These election polls are trying to guess who will actually turn out to vote. There are a couple of different ways they do that. Most of the time it's based on whether the person says they're going to turn out to vote. So it's hard to know. Pollsters take that into account as well as past voting patterns. But each new year, one of the things that happened in 2016 was that who voted looked fundamentally different than it had in 2008 and 2012. So people who were comparing back to 2012 missed some of the movement among the non-college educated folks who shifted toward Trump and held a heavier weight, pun not intended there, in the election overall.
Okay. So you brought up forecasts, and I want to ask about those. So there's people like Nate Silver at 538.com and the Upshot, the New York Times, and there's several of these other places. They make predictions about who's going to win or lose. But that's a little different from what pollsters do, right? So what's the difference between a forecast and like what a pollster does?
The common refrain among pollsters is that a poll is a snapshot in time. The only time period that a poll is trying to represent is the time that it was taken. So not even when it's released, the time when it was actually in the field. In the field is kind of lingo for when they were actually calling people, when the emails were going out, when people were responding to the poll questions themselves. So while polls are supposed to be representative of a larger population, they're not supposed to be representative of a larger time period. They're very time bound. That's why I was just saying the events right before the election are not going to show up in a poll. Forecasting breaks that rule. Forecasting is pushing the data to say, here's what will happen in November. We're sitting here at whatever moment in time. Some forecasts are released a long time ahead of time. I believe the Economist forecast was the first one to come out this year. It debuted in June. So what they were fundamentally saying was, here's the data in June. Let's do a whole bunch of statistics to this so that we can say, we think this data in June means that Joe Biden has a X percent, I believe it started at about 80% probability of winning the election in November. So it's trying to project on that time. That gets really complicated because particularly when you're resting it on polling data, which is what most of the media, public, kind of pop forecasting does. There is a line of academic work that does forecasting. It is less tied to polls and more about building structural models of how presidential elections work. That's not what I'm talking about here. The ones that rely on polling are trying to guess how accurate the polls will be. In general, polls are pretty accurate at anticipating the election outcome. surprisingly far out. There's been empirical political science work done on, how long before an election a poll can be accurate. And basically within the last 100 days or so, they're fairly accurate. However, if the election is close, that accuracy, the level of accuracy matters. If you have about 5 percentage points of error in a race that's divided by 2 percentage points, that's a different matter.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned like some probability of winning. I think people are very bad about understanding probabilities, and some of these sources are trying to get better at how do you describe them. I think one of the favorite ones I saw was The Upshot. They said basically the probability that Donald Trump would win the 2016 election is the same as an NFL field goal kicker missing a field goal. This is before they pushed it back a bit.
Right.
And so I think that's good because if you watch football all Sunday, you're going to see one kicker miss a field goal. You're like, oh, okay, it could happen. But if you say someone has an 80% chance of winning, I think people think like, well, it's a sure thing, but it's not, right? There's that 20%
right.
error in there. And I do want to mention real briefly, so you talk about a snapshot in time, the figure behind me is President Trump's approval, disapproval. And if you look sort of at the end of the series there, the red goes up, right? And that's, I think, because of the coronavirus. So his disapproval went up. And so there's an event, and you don't know if there's going to be other events between now and the election, like you brought up the FBI's investigation of Hillary Clinton's email. So that's one reason why making predictions with a snapshot is very difficult. So, okay, I'll ask one more question, my wrap-up question for everyone else. So if you could wave your political science wand, or if you have a pollster wand, you're qualified in both, and have people know one thing about government, what would that be?
I would say that the one thing I want people to understand is that not everyone thinks the same way. And just because you don't know people that hold a certain view or think government should operate a certain way, doesn't mean that doesn't exist. It means you might not have been exposed to it. In this country, we are very pocketed by where we live, and political geography is fascinating and it's huge. We're very sorted in where we live and what we are exposed to, and I think more people understanding the broad diversity of opinion that exists in this nation, and just the range of views that exist outside of what you even can imagine, would help people to understand why we have the debates we do within our government. Why are the things that are so divisive in Congress so divisive? That can be hard to understand if you don't have a full grasp of where people are coming from, what areas those Congress people are representing, what different views exist across the nation. As not that Congress people always perfectly represent their jurisdiction, but in general, I think a lot of the lack of understanding each other plays into a lack of understanding the big picture of things that get argued out in the halls of government.
All right, yeah, that's good to know. Good to know. All right, well, thanks for being with us today. Appreciate you talking to us about polling. I think we learned a lot about how it works and making predictions and snapshots in time. So thanks.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah.